We are going to be recording this session so that it will be available for people who were not able to attend live. So just to let you know that we will be doing that. And then it will be available to the rest of our registrants who did not log on, although many of you are logged on. So that is fantastic. Thanks so much for being here. I think we may have settled into a number, and so we will get started. It is 1 o'clock. I wanted to welcome everyone once again to our inaugural webinar on how to write a successful letter of intent for APDA. We have never done this type of webinar before, but we have noticed a need for it. People actively applying for our grants ask lots of questions, lots of great questions, and we figured, maybe this information should be disseminated to everyone prior to submission, so people really have the best chance of producing an LOI that our scientific advisory board will find the most useful and be able to analyze it for potential moving it on to a full application. Wanted to give everyone the best shot possible to see what it is we're looking for. And so we decided to do this webinar. I want to thank Dr. Standaert, who I'll introduce formally in a minute, who's the chairman of our scientific advisory board, who agreed to give this presentation. So thanks everyone again for being here today. My name is Rebcca Gilbert. I'm Chief Mission Officer here at APDA. And I will give a bit of an overview about what APDA is, how we came to be giving grants at all, and give you a little bit of an introduction so you know who we are. So American Parkinson's Disease Association is a grassroots organization that provides support, education, and research to everyone impacted by Parkinson's, and really giving everyone the best chance to live life to the fullest. APDA was founded in 1961. We're based in Staten Island, New York, but we have chapters and information and referral centers across the country. And so most likely there is something more local to where you are working. And so our services that we provide across the country take the shape of 3 main buckets. We have information and referral, so we refer people to various Parkinson's resources in their area. We also provide education and support services in the form of support groups and various other educational forum, as well as conferences, and also health and wellness programming. Connecting through art would be one, exercise and movement classes. For people who are not able to access us locally, we have a lot of national programming, including helpline, an app, publications in 3 languages, webinars in 3 languages. We have lots of information on our website. We have patient interaction software such as Smart Patients, training courses, and a rehab resource center, among other assets. And so the third branch of what we do support education and referral, but we also fund research. And that's why you guys are here to hear about that. And so we have 5 main grants, or 5 grants that we give to individuals. We also have a center grant that we give to centers, but that is not relevant to the people participating today. And so we'll talk about our grants to individuals. We have 5 grants, which I'll talk about separately, but just to go through the timeline about why you're here. So our LOI is due December 16th, and that will lead to a review process, which Dr. Standaert will talk about, and invitations for full applications will then be given for February, and then full applications will be due in April. We will review those full applications and notify people of their awards in June, and the application or the grant year starts September 1st. So that will be September 1st, 2025 to August 31st, 2026. So let's go through the grants that you potentially, whoever's on the call, potentially would be applying for. We have our George C. Cotzias Memorial Fellowship. This is a 3-year career development award, and it is aimed for neurologists, so people who see patients and also do research. It's $100,000 a year for 3 years. We have our postdoctoral fellowship. This is a 2-year grant for people who have finished their PhD and are working in a postdoctoral capacity, and that's $50,000 a year for 2 years. We have our biggest grant category, which is our general research grant. It's a 1-year award for Parkinson's disease investigators usually, but not always, at the assistant professor level, and that's $75K a year. The first three, Dr. Standaert will talk about sort of topics that have been addressed in the past about these grants, but we do not issue a specific topic for which those three grants need to align. The last two grants, however, are more directed, and so they're slightly different. The next one is Diversity in Parkinson's Disease Research Grant. It's a one-year award to support research scientists studying health disparities and or differences among understudied PD communities, and that's for 1 year, $75K. And our newest grant, which Dr. Dan will not be talking a tremendous amount about, but if you have any questions, you certainly can reach out to myself or Elvin Yao, who is our program and research manager. And that is the Social Sciences and Parkinson's Disease Research Grant, which is a 1 year award to support research scientists studying social issues related to Parkinson's disease. So on that note, I would like to now introduce Dr. Standaert, who will be giving the rest of the presentation. And Dr. Standaert received his MD and PhD degrees from Washington University in St. Louis. Following his neurology residency at University of Pennsylvania, he was appointed a Howard Hughes Fellow and completed a 3-year research and clinical fellowship in movement disorders at Mass General, and was a member of the faculty at Harvard Medical School until 2006, when he relocated to the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where he's currently the John N. Whitaker Professor and Chair of the Department of Neurology, and of course, a senior member of the Division of Movement Disorders there at the University of Alabama. And he is near and dear to APDA's heart. He's been the chairman of the Scientific Advisory Board of APDA for many years. I don't want to get the number wrong. And also has a long-standing history with APDA because he actually was a Cotzias awardee himself. And so I now turn the mic over to Dr. Standaert, who will give details on what our SAB is looking for in an LOI. Dr. Standaert, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Rebecca, for that introduction. And thank you all for joining us today to talk about grants at the APDA, a topic that is near and dear to my heart. Spent quite a number of years working for APDA, and the job isn't finished until Parkinson's isn't with us any longer. So I'm glad to have all of you on board and committed to the effort. If we can advance the slide here. All right, so let me talk a little bit about what the priorities of the APDA are. And it's important to think about this because obviously there are a lot of granting agencies out there, and APDA has considered where it can make the greatest impact. And our focus really is on support for new investigators and new ideas. These are the two sort of driving factors that we think about when we decide what is the priority of this grant. Is this something where APDA really should engage? New investigators, most often early career scientists, mostly postdoctoral or assistant professor level. However, if we can go to the next bullet point here, that it can also include established investigators who've not worked on Parkinson's disease before. So we, in fact, have funded full professors who have had very distinguished careers in other areas of science, but have decided to do something important and impactful in Parkinson's and are looking for the seed money to do that. So, that would fall, in our mind, under the new investigator because we're bringing someone established into the field. As for new ideas, that's pretty broad, but it can include new hypotheses, could include a new technology and the studies needed to launch that and bring it into Parkinson's research, or new therapeutic approaches. So all of these are fair game, but the committee really takes to heart this message of we're looking to support new investigators and new ideas, and this is the lens that we view the applications through. The next slide there. So what's a successful APDA grant? Well, as you recognize, these are not large governmental grants. These are smaller grants, but a success for us is one that provides the launch that a new investigator needs to continue their work in the field, or to take a new idea and launch it and let it obtain the funding that it needs to grow. And future development through other mechanisms, governmental, industry, philanthropy, other funding sources. These are successful outcomes of an APDA grant. So we really like to think about how we're planting the seed here and hoping that it can be leveraged into something much larger through our support, can bring it forward and enable it to tap into these other sources. So that's really how we think about priorities. As far as scope, what are the areas of science that you could consider in an APDA research grant? We don't really specify this, so it is wide open, and we are looking for ideas we haven't thought of. So don't think of this as just the list of the only possibilities. These I gathered just by looking back over the last few years and saying, well, what kind of things have we funded? We've done a lot of things on molecular mechanisms of Parkinson's, also circuit mechanisms of Parkinson's. Obviously, a big interest in preventing neurodegeneration in Parkinson's, however that might be accomplished. Things around treatment of Parkinson's, effects of drugs in Parkinson's, management of complications of treatment, things like levodopa-induced dyskinesia, but also mood disorders, sleep disorders, fatigue, all kinds of complications of treatment would be fair game. A lot of interest these days in Parkinson's subtypes, and you could read many papers about this. There's a number of them in the literature and more coming out. But if you have something really new or insightful or a topic that would really shed some new light on this question of subtypes, that would be interesting. Genetics and genomics of Parkinson's, certainly fair game, although the key here is to consider the scale, and we'll get to that in a minute. Genetics and genomics sometimes involves projects of such large scale that they may not be a good fit. But the areas of interest to us, animal cellular models, things like exercise and rehabilitation in Parkinson's is certainly a great topic for an APDA grant. Caregiver issues in Parkinson's have a big impact on both the patient and the caregiver, and that's something we'd be interested in. Mental health issues, deep brain stimulation, environmental agents, infections in Parkinson's, neuroimaging, basal ganglia and motor control, more as they relate to Parkinson's and Parkinson's symptoms, and then immunology of Parkinson's disease. So all of these are really fair game, but this is not the list of the only possible topics. This is just some examples to give you the flavor of how broad a scope that we really have. The next slide, just to think about a few things that we probably would not be interested in funding. First of all, things that are not really about Parkinson's disease. We are the American Parkinson's Disease Association, so if the main focus is Alzheimer's or stroke or something like this, probably not going to really get a high priority from the committee. I always get the question about, well, what about other kinds of Parkinsonian disorders? PSP, multiple system atrophy, these can have certainly Parkinsonian features. I would say that's a maybe. If the study makes sense to do in PSP or MSA because there's a special patient population or it's a question that can be asked there, that certainly could be valuable. I think we would be looking to the question of, well, would that create more generalized knowledge about neurodegeneration? In other words, could you use PSP as kind of a laboratory to study the topic of neurodegeneration more broadly? Things that are too large are one of the things that really are difficult for us to support. So, obviously industry-sponsored clinical trials and really large-scale clinical trials that would take a lot of funding and a lot of time. These really aren't great projects for APDA because our funding is typically 1 or 2 years for the postdocs, and these projects often cost hundreds of thousands or millions, so really not a great project for APDA. And so thinking about things that could fit within the time frame, the 1 year or possibly 2 if it's renewed, and the scope and the funding available is important. The next slide. All right, let me talk a little bit about the review process. So it starts with submitting a letter of intent, which is the upcoming deadline that Rebcca was talking about. The next bullet, gonna have to click through these. So these are reviewed by the Scientific Advisory Board, and I'll give you the listing of the members of the Scientific Advisory Board in a minute. And so from all the letters of intent that we get, we pull out a subset to submit full applications. These are then reviewed by 2 or 3 members. Each full application gets assigned to at least 2 or 3 reviewers of the Scientific Advisory Board. They're scored. We use a kind of typical NIH scale. And then the top applications are discussed by the full Scientific Advisory Board in a virtual meeting. So this is a very NIH-like process in a way. where there's a preliminary round of letters of intent and then full applications, and the top group of full applications is discussed by the full committee. We in the end come to a list of applications that we recommend for funding. The Scientific Advisory Board does not actually fund the applications. That's done by the APDA Board of Directors. So we make a recommendation to that board. They make the final decision on the funding of awards. Then there's a notification that's released. There are agreements between APDA and institutions because these are institutional awards, and then the grant funding starts. So this whole cycle begins in December, as Rebcca said, with a letter of intent. The notice of awards are going to come out in June, and typically funding starts about September 1st for an APDA grant. So that's the timing and the process. The next slide. So this illustrates what happened last year, just so you can get some idea of what this looks like. So letters of intent, we got a lot. Over 200 letters of intent were submitted last year. The categories, most of them were research grant letter of intents, 157 of them. There's 36 for postdoc, 25 for the diversity, and 4 for the Cotzias. What did we invite for full review? We invited 45 of those for full review. 26 of the research grants, and you can see the numbers for the other categories there. And then ultimately awarded were 19. So on the one hand, we do get a lot of letters of intent, and we invite only a smaller group of them for full review. But once you make it to full review, actually almost 40% of the grants that made it to full review were ultimately funded. So we think this is a good process and a good use of everyone's time. The letters of intent are not that difficult to write. They're short, and we would rather not take people's time writing very extensive grant applications if they don't have a good chance. On the other hand, if you do make it to full review, as I said, you have almost a 40% probability of getting funded, which is pretty strong compared to other mechanisms. The advisory board here, this is the APDA Scientific Advisory Board on the right. There are many very distinguished and well-known scientists and physicians and others who work in Parkinson's disease here. They represent a very broad range of interests, from neuropathology to physical therapy to molecular biology, stem cell biology, circuitry, neuropsychiatry, deep brain stimulation. So we try to cover the field, and we're constantly turning over members of this board every year. We add 1 or 2 new ones. So, but it is a board that takes their job very seriously, I would say. We hold this full day meeting where we review the full applications, and the committee is very much involved in this. And many of these committee members have worked with APDA for quite a few years. The next slide. So some tips for writing a great APDA letter of intent. So these are a few of my thoughts on this. First of all, think about the priorities I talked about in the beginning. Is this application coming from a new investigator or an established investigator who's new to the field? And making that clear in the letter of intent is really helpful to us. And of course, then, of course, is it a novel idea? Is this really a new idea? We don't really need a follow-on to things that have already been done, but try to convey to us how this application is from a new investigator and how the idea that underlies it is novel. The next bullet. Emphasize the significance of the project. So ask yourself, if this project works, how will this help the community of people impacted by Parkinson's disease? That's really what we're after. That's what APDA wants to do, is they want to help the community of people that are affected by this disease. So thinking about the significance of the project and how a successful execution of this would move the field forward. Now, maybe that would just enable you to go write an R01 and get a large grant to do the next step. That's a successful outcome, but try to explain to us what the significance of completing the project would be. The next bullet, is the third is considering the scale of the project. So as I said, the awards are either 1 or 2 years. It is possible to renew a research grant sometimes for a second year, but we don't want to see that in the beginning. We want to see a plan of something that can be accomplished reasonably within 1 year and would really make a difference for the field. So that's important. Think about something that's feasible in the time frame of these grants. Second, sample size and power is a major issue with these kinds of awards. We struggle with this all the time, where someone has a great idea, but they propose a study that's just too small to answer the question. And you know, since the APDA funds are limited, you may have to rethink your question and carve off a piece of the problem and do something that you can accomplish within the boundaries of this grant, and convince us that you have an adequate sample size and power to accomplish what you propose to in the study. Doing a study that is a great idea but is underpowered doesn't really help anyone because it's unlikely to produce an answer. So that's not an outcome that we want. We'd much rather have a more compact and focused project that can achieve its goals than to have a big, complicated project that probably can't get done in the space of 1 or 2 years. The next slide. For research grants, thinking about key resources. So if you're going to propose studying a patient group, do you actually have access to those patients? If you're going to study a mouse, does that mouse exist? Do you have that mouse? If you're studying data or samples, do you have access to that? Or if you're using novel methods or methods that are really new or innovative, try to convince us that you have access to the methods and the techniques that you need. Or if you've never done the method before, at least maybe you have a consultant who's going to help you to execute the project by giving you advice on how to do that method. And next bullet, postdoc grants. These are mentored awards, and it's really important to think about how the planned mentor will help the project and what their role will be. So research grants are independent awards typically. Postdoc grants, there really should be a mentor, and the mentor should be very much involved. When you get to the full application, we're going to expect a letter from the mentor describing their role. So giving us some flavor of that in the letter of intent is going to be important. And one piece of advice we just offer here is sometimes we see people using the research grant mechanism when the project really should be a mentored postdoctoral proposal. So if the applicant really is a postdoc, they're working under the supervision of another scientist, they're working in their lab, they're using their resources, and they really need the mentoring and advice, then they ought to put in a postdoctoral proposal. Sometimes people will approach this and say, well, let's just put in a research grant, but spend all the money on the postdoc salary support. That usually doesn't work out that well. The next bullet here. What about budget? We do not require a detailed budget in the letter of intent, and that means that you don't necessarily need institutional sign-off. What do I mean? It says it's optional. That means the APDA is not going to require it. Now, your own institution may have its own rules about what you can submit. But as far as APDA is concerned, at the letter of intent stage, we do not need an institutional sign-off. For postdoc grants, it's not surprising and fairly typical that most of the budget goes to the salary support of the postdoc, and that's perfectly acceptable in a postdoctoral grant proposal. For research grants, we expect to see some salary support for the PI, but that's usually not where all of the funding goes. A research grant really should be carrying some of the other costs of the project, whether that's materials, resources, core facilities, whatever the other costs are. So this is a difference in the way that they're budgeted. Typically, postdoc grants are heavily focused on funding the salary of the postdoc. Whereas research grants really should be funding the project costs and perhaps some salary support for the PI, but not 100% effort. All right, next. I think that's the last slide, Rebecca. So I will turn it back over to you, and maybe we have some questions.
Great. Thank you so much. So a lot of great tips there. We are eager to hear what you want to know that has not been addressed yet. So if you could put any questions you have in the chat, I think. And actually, there's that we have a Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to start asking some of the Q&A questions. So we have a question from Ari Zolan. Is an MD PhD in a combined research and clinical fellowship eligible for the postdoc fellowship?
We have done that at times, and Rebecca will correct me if you think differently. But I think if it's a fellowship that really has a strong enough research component, we have done that. And the other option for an MD PhD in a combined research and clinical fellowship, of course, is the Cotzias Fellowship. The Cotzias is really the premier award from the APDA. It's designed for physician scientists. It requires you to be an MD and licensable in the United States, and it is really by far the strongest way to go if you can qualify for that. If you're not ready for that and you have a strong research component of your clinical fellowship and you have a mentor and it's a mentored situation, we have funded those as postdoctoral fellowships before.
Great, thank you. So a question from Angie Perone. Do your research grants fund qualitative projects?
I would say yes. I think that is a question, though, that's appropriate to the hypothesis you're asking. If it's a question that is best answered by a qualitative approach, say a study in social behavior or social science or caregiver stress or caregiver burden, those can be qualitative projects.
Great. So we have a great question. How much preliminary data is required for postdoctoral fellowships, or for any of
Um,
the grants you can answer?
Well, for postdoctoral fellowships, not very much. We really could do it with essentially a strong commitment from the mentor and a really good idea is enough for a postdoctoral fellowship usually. So if it's within the scope of what the mentor's skills are, in other words, they can teach you what you need, and you have a really strong idea, that's very frequently enough for a postdoctoral fellowship.
Okay, great. And then another question, are the applications reviewed anonymously?
They reviewed anonymously. No, they're not reviewed anonymously. And this is a very interesting question in application review in general is can you achieve true anonymous review of applications? As you probably know, some grant agencies have experimented with this, but it's been problematic when it's been tried. I think anyway, at this stage, APDA is not reviewing them anonymously. We do assign multiple reviewers to them, and but we don't actually try to mask the identity of the applicant.
Okay, great. How does the development of new tools for assessing Parkinson's patients fall within the scope of a research grant?
I think that's a good use of a research grant if you have a new tool, whether that is a device or could even be a rating scale, could be approach something like this. What we would be looking for is a rigorous approach to testing and validating that in a patient population to show us that it would actually work. So if you took that on with some device or a rating scale or I don't know, motion tracking, something like this, give us a design that at the end of the year we would have confidence this thing actually does what you say it should do.
Okay, great. Tons of questions. This is great. How would you contrast, you sort of answered this, but maybe to be more pointed, how would you contrast the scientific questions or the type of support that APDA can provide versus other Parkinson's foundations, such as PF or Michael J. Fox?
Well, we're all in this for the same cause, right? All these organizations are seeking to improve the lives of people with Parkinson's and ultimately cure the disease. They do have different approaches, and honestly, I've worked with all three of those organizations that you mentioned at different times. Their awards, some of these awards are not that different from the way PF has structured some of their awards. I don't want to do a point-by-point comparison. Michael J. Fox Foundation, often those are larger projects and not necessarily as focused on early investigators as APDA is. But in the end, it's all good. This is all the support is needed by the Parkinson's community.
Great. For the Cotzias Award, is this geared toward new faculty or does this also include postdoctoral fellows?
It often includes people in clinical fellowship or early stages of faculty. So if you're a movement disorder fellow and you're moving towards a faculty position or you have an early faculty position, those are both good times to think about the Cotzias Award. What we're
Great.
really looking for there is we're looking for physician scientists and people who are really committed to a career in Parkinson's disease care and research. That is the sort of typical mold of a Cotzias fellow.
Great. Um, is it reasonable, is it reasonable to have two applications targeting postdoc grant and research grant in a way that the research grant can afford the research costs? Meaning, can you apply one project in two categories?
Well, it's very unlikely we would fund both of those things. And so it will come down to one or the other. And I think it really becomes a question of, are you at a place where you in your career where it's still best for you to have a mentor and have a mentored award, or are you really at a place where it's reasonable to be applying as an independent investigator? So, if you've just joined a lab and you're brand new there and you're a postdoc, probably best to apply for a postdoctoral award because you need that mentor to lead you forward. If you haven't published in the field before, if you haven't done work in the field before, you're going to need that mentor to move you forward. If you're feeling that you're more established and you want to apply independently, that would be a research grant. But generally, we do see that sometimes where people apply in both categories, and we usually will not support both of them for sure.
Great. Is the research grant aimed to provide seed funding for an NIH grant, or could it be considered seed funding for other philanthropic sources?
I think any source that is a further step forward for a research grant is great. NIH is fantastic, but if there are other opportunities, DoD, philanthropy, other foundations, we just want to see that we fund a project that really starts something going and moves forward. And whatever way that can move forward is fine with us. But we are looking for that outcome of led to a next step funded by an agency that can bring more to the table.
Great. How many years after a PhD is a person eligible for the postdoctoral fellowship? We get that question every year.
Okay, Rebecca, what's the right answer?
What is it? I think we've settled on 3 to 5.
Yes, yes.
So
And there's a
that's
little wiggle room in there,
there's a
depending
wiggle
on.
room. Yes.
Again, it's the point of a postdoctoral award is to work in a mentored situation with a mentor playing a significant role in it. As I said, when you get to a full application for a postdoc, we're going to ask for a detailed letter from the mentor describing what exactly they're going to do to help you and how they're going to participate in moving this project forward. And so, if you have that kind of relationship with a mentor, that's a great thing. If there's no mentor involved, it really can't be a postdoc, and it's not going to work in that category if there's no mentor that's committed.
So a related question, which we also get frequently. So what if somebody has a PhD, is still in a mentored position, but is not officially a postdoc? Can they apply for a postdoc award?
Yeah, I think they can. And these issues of what institutions call a postdoc, every institution has different rules about this. Some have time limits on it and things, but we're really, you know, we're looking for 3 to 5 years. Beyond 5 years after a PhD, we probably would not consider somebody a postdoc. And if you don't have a mentor involved, then it really isn't going to work as a postdoctoral application.
So a couple questions about sort of that jump between I'm in a mentored position, but not a postdoc. When do I apply for Cotzias? Um, maybe talk a
Well,
little bit about that.
yeah, I mean, I think the time to think about the Cotzias is if you're on that career trajectory to be an independent physician scientist working in Parkinson's disease primarily. One thing that's helpful is to go and look at the list of previous Cotzias recipients, and it gives you some flavor for the kind of people who've been supported by that mechanism. And I think they're all on the website now.
Yes.
And so that can be helpful to you. As I said, most people apply while they're a movement disorder fellow, maybe a year or two into their movement disorder fellowship, or very early in their first faculty appointment. Those are typical times to apply for a Cotzias award.
All right. What about research being done outside of America? Do we
We do
support that?
occasionally fund projects outside of America. It is the American Parkinson's Disease Association, but we have funded projects, I know, in Italy, a few other countries, I think in Africa. So it's not a complete no, although it has to be a compelling project.
Fantastic. So a couple questions about our new social sciences grant. Can you discuss some additional details and explain more about the social sciences mechanism? Um,
I'm going to let you answer that one.
You want me to answer? So this is brand new, and this is something that we are evolving as we speak into how we're going to craft this. But we're looking for applications from a range of departments that we typically did not get applications from before, and that would include our rehabilitation medicine colleagues, social work schools, as well as gerontology, public health, any department that is sort of aligned with studying Parkinson's disease, but is not necessarily involved in cell biology or biochemistry or any of the other topics that Dr. Standaert went through. And so we're looking for applications or for research projects that are aimed at improving the quality of life of people with Parkinson's disease in whatever form that your department may attack that problem. And so we're really looking for a variety of ideas, and we're open to your thoughts. So please send us your best ideas. In terms of the actual LOI, it's going to be it is extremely similar. It is identical to the LOIs of all the other applications. So everything that Dr. Standaert mentioned about the nuts and bolts, about the different LOI categories would apply. So we want to make sure that if it is somebody in a mentored position, that they have a good mentor, that they have the facilities in their department to accomplish their task, that their budget makes sense, that it's not a project that's too big or too small, that it's powered correctly. So all the things that Dr. Standaert talked about in terms of what would raise the kind of the red flags about an LOI apply for the social sciences grant as well. It really is just the kernel of the idea that would be different and the source of the department that the idea is coming from. So hopefully that helps to explain what we're looking for in those categories. Let's see. The next category. Is it safe to assume that if a similar project was funded last year, that a similar submission is likely to be a lower priority for the APDA this year? So I suppose yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. If it was funded last year and it was a big success and the proposal is to continue and take the next step, that might be exciting. I don't know that proposing exactly the same thing as was proposed the previous year would take you very far, but there are hot topics and hot areas in science, and if you've latched onto one and we funded it one year, sometimes we see this. We see trends in the application where a new technique or a new idea will come in. These days, what are some hot ideas? I mean, we've seen a lot of things about synuclein seeding assays. You see, a lot of things about GBA and lysosomal processes, but these things tend to have there's a wave of excitement in the scientific community, and you get projects on related topics. But just because we funded it last year doesn't rule it out this year, as long as it's moving the idea further down the pipeline.
So along those lines, as somebody who has been awarded a research grant and wants to apply for a second year, what is the process for seeking funding for that second year of funding?
Well, there's two things. First of all, if you have a research grant, you will have a required 6-month progress report. So it would be good if you have submitted that 6-month progress report, and we have that in hand. And then usually we take an LOI for the second year of funding, right, Rebecca? Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Yeah, and
so if you've had a first year and you're kind of at the end of it and you want to put in an LOI for another year of funding, you can do that.
Okay, great. So we have a question here. If you are an associate professor, you have a small history of Parkinson's disease research and a novel idea, would you be considered for a research grant?
Well, yes, I think it would come under the question of, is this bringing someone with new to the field? I mean, you say it's all history of Parkinson's. If you really haven't done a lot in that area, but you have special knowledge or special skills that seem really valuable to the field, we would encourage that. We like to find people who maybe have spent a whole career studying some scientific technique or have special knowledge, but just never thought about Parkinson's much before. That's a great person to bring to the field. So, but those are the factors, and I would encourage you to try to explain that to us in the LOI about how this would bring valuable new insight and talents to Parkinson's.
Great. So this is a good question. If you've been awarded the Cotzias Award, could some of the funds of year 1 or 2 be pushed to year 3?
They can. Now it's not an automatic carry forward, but there is a carry forward process at APDA. It largely involves, first of all, submitting your progress reports on time, and then working with Rebecca and I to talk about carry forwards. We do carry forwards from one year to the next with these awards. And we also do no cost extensions, but you have to justify them.
Okay, great. Do you accept AI-based PD research grant proposals?
Sure, of course. Why not? If it's a great idea, I think it'd be really interesting. I'm actually kind of expecting to get some this year. I don't know that I've seen very many in the past, but this seems like the year for it.
Absolutely. So a couple questions. Do you have to be in a tenure track faculty position to apply for a research grant?
No.
Okay, great. Another good question. Would an exercise or rehab focused grant be better addressed in the research grant mechanism or the social sciences mechanism?
Depends on what you're asking about exercise and rehabilitation. If you're thinking about how does the exercise work, what are the mechanisms, how do you optimize and find the best exercise prescription, that's typical sort of research grant areas. I guess if I were thinking more about how do I bring an exercise program to, say, an underserved community, that might be more of a social science project. But I don't know if you have ideas about that, Rebecca.
Yeah, I think that would be a good demarcation. I would definitely not say that every rehab grant is automatically social sciences grants at all. There are some that are very applicable to our research portfolio. If you have a specific question about your grant and where it lies, and a lot of the questions are around this, we should give our email addresses. We'll put our email addresses in the chat, my email and Alvin Yao, and you can ask us if any of the questions don't really, any of the answers don't really answer exactly what you're asking. Then after this, you can maybe get some more clarification as well. So don't worry if you still have some questions when we're done. So another great question. We have somebody who wants to submit a project on the peripheral nervous system. And does our focus have to be on the central nervous system?
No, it has to be on Parkinson's disease, but there are effects of Parkinson's on the peripheral nervous system. A lot of interest these days in synuclein and nerve fibers and dysautonomia and things like this. Our anchor point is Parkinson's disease, but it doesn't have to be central nervous system. Parkinson's is a whole body disease.
So back to a question about being outside the US. Would it help if the person applying from outside the US has a United States collaboration?
That would help. As I said, we have funded grants from international applicants before. I do think we're looking for really strong grant proposals if we're going to go outside the U.S., but we will do it.
Okay. What about researchers submitting a grant together?
You can do that. If you're from the same institution, it's relatively easy. If you're from separate institutions, it gets a little challenging because then you're subcontracting, or dividing the award, and it's possible to do that, but they're not large awards, and so subcontracting sometimes gets a little challenging. It's a lot of paperwork for a relatively small grant.
Okay, somebody who submitted a research grant last year and was not funded, should they submit the same application again? They'd like to revise, but don't know how to revise. What would you suggest?
Well, I would at least probably not submit exactly the same application again because, as you see, we get a lot of them. We have a long memory too. Oftentimes the committee will look at them and say, I know I saw this before. So I think thinking about how to revise it. Now, one of the questions, of course, is can we provide feedback on these applications? And it's difficult for us to do that. If you can imagine trying to provide feedback on 220 written letters of intent from a committee which is all volunteers is very difficult to do. So we really can't do that. I have to say, you're going to have to rely on local colleagues, get some colleagues locally or that in other institutions to read your grant for you and give you some feedback. It's just not possible for APDA. We're not structured to be able to give a written grant summary on every one of the applications we get.
Okay, question on the diversity grant. Is it exclusively about disparities in care, or are other relevant topics related to PD valid?
I think a lot of topics can be tackled in a diversity grant. I mean, these came out of actually an editorial that Rebecca and I wrote some years ago now. If you go look at movement disorders, you'll find a piece we wrote about diversity in Parkinson's research. And this emerged from the sort of recognition in the field that we hadn't really developed very much diversity in Parkinson's research. We were studying only small groups of people, predominantly of Western European descent, and there was so much more to learn out there. And this was the motivation for the diversity grants. And so I think there are many aspects of diversity. We've funded grants in the genetics in diverse populations, care models in diverse populations. You can think about treatment responses in diverse populations, exercise in diverse populations. I mean, all of these are fair game, and probably a lot more.
Excellent. Okay. Um, the category you've mentioned a few times, new investigator. Would that be considered the same for NIH? Would it be the same sort of definition that NIH uses?
Well, they use a very strict definition. As you know, it's 10 years beyond your last training, and they have rules about whether you've had an R01 or not. We are not that strict with our definition. We're a little more flexible with what the definition should be, but I think in our mind, a new investigator is somebody who has completed their training in within the last few years at least, is new to the field, has maybe published some, but not extensively. I think people who've had an R01 or a multiple R01 holder probably don't qualify as new investigators any longer in our mind. Um, but if the R01 was in another topic, you had an R01 on Alzheimer's disease, but you're coming to Parkinson's and you want to work there, that would fit with our idea of a new investigator.
Oh, great. So this is a good question about what we're looking for in a Cotzias. Is the primary goal to fund the Cotzias person or to fund the project? Are we looking for the people or the project?
The people, when it comes to the Cotzias, the person is the most important thing, I would say. The project needs to be good. It needs to be the kind of project that will advance someone's career, that will really help them get to where they're going. But we spend a lot of time thinking about the person with a Cotzias application. What kind of training have they had? Is this somebody who really is going to stay with us in the field of Parkinson's, involved in the care of patients with Parkinson's disease and doing important research in the area? So that's the thing we're looking for. The project needs to be, a good project, and it needs to be the kind where the field will be interested, and the success of that project is likely to carry them forward in their career.
Okay, great. We had a couple questions for the social sciences grant. Will we have the same reviewers as the other grants? This we are in active discussion about. It is possible we will have a separate review committee, but David will be involved in the final decision on that. So to be decided.
That's much the way we do the diversity grants. There's a separate committee that reviews them, but then the top ones come to the regular SAB at the end for discussion.
So likely we'll do the same for this. Great. Okay, I'm just combing through the questions that okay, so we have a question on the budget section of the LOI. What distribution of funding do you generally see? So, you mentioned that postdoc often has primarily salary, research not as much. What would be sort of a typical distribution of funding?
Typical, well, as I said, the postdoc can be all, you can just say, look, it's all for the salary of the postdoc, and that'll be fine. We're not concerned about that. We're assuming that the other project costs are coming from the mentor in that situation, right? So that's the role of the mentor. They're providing the lab and the materials and this kind of thing, and the postdoc award is going to support the salary of the postdoc, and that's perfectly fine. In a research grant, we probably wouldn't want to see that because we'd rather see some reflection of the actual project costs in the research grant. So typically what you might see is efforts that are 20, 30, 40% investigator effort on the research grant at most, and then the rest is supplies, materials, other kinds of things, research coordinators if you're doing a clinical project.
Great. So a couple questions. You talked a little bit about preliminary data. Is there any difference in preliminary data for a postdoctoral fellowship versus a research grant? Would you expect more or less? How would you think a little bit more about
Well,
that
I said
topic?
the postdoc you don't need much because we're counting on the strength of the mentor there typically. A research grant, it helps to have some. We're not looking for a lot. We are, willing. We're taking some chances on new ideas here, but we need to know that at least it's feasible that what you're proposing can work. We don't need, NIH is often looking for data that shows that it will be a success. I think we have a lower bar. We're looking for data that shows that you could actually do the project, and we don't know whether it'll be a success. That's what science is about. You do things, you don't know what's going to happen. So, so we definitely have a lower bar than NIH would with a grant, but we do need some evidence that this technique you're proposing can actually work, or that the methods you have can actually be done and will give you the kind of outputs that you need for this project.
Okay, fantastic. So more or less, our questions have been answered in some form. We'll do one last question. This is another one based outside the US. So we discussed that we have funded outside the US. If somebody has a collaboration, that could be beneficial. What if somebody does not have a collaboration, but they're not going to apply for salary, just for experimental cost? Would that make any difference?
I mean, that's fine to do that. We do get applications where it says, the institution has agreed to cover the salary and this is all for project costs. Um, that would be fine. When you get to the full application, it would be good to have a letter from someone in authority to say that that's the case. We would be looking for that, for not so much in the LOI, but in the full application. It would be really helpful to have a letter from university administration or somewhere saying they've agreed to cover the salary and that these are for project costs.
Okay, fantastic. I think we have answered all the questions in some form. We had over 50 questions, so thank you so much for everyone's contribution. Oh, this is one question that just came in, which is actually a very good question. So we'll end on this one, which is what about previous publications? How much does that weigh in on your application?
Well, I think to some extent it's good. It's good to see. It depends on the category, first of all. Cotzias application, and that's really great. We're kind of looking for that, someone who's at least published something in the field, because we're expecting them to do a lot more in the future. Postdocs, it's good to have some publications from your graduate career. But they don't necessarily have to be on exactly the topic you're proposing to work on. So I think there's some flexibility there. Research grants, if you've published something recently and the grant is the logical next step, I need this money. I've published something and my next step is need some funding, and this is a good setup for a research grant as well. So
Great.
we don't have a
I
specific count though or number that you have to have.
Fair enough. I lied. I said that was our last question, but somebody wanted clarification. I realized we did not provide this clarification. So somebody had asked, I'm an assistant professor and I have an R01. Am I eligible for the research grant?
You're eligible. The question would be how high would the priority be assigned? If it's on the same topic as your R01, probably would not get us excited. If you have a really great new idea that spins off and is in a different direction than your R01, we would definitely be interested in seeing that.
Fantastic. All right. So on that note, we are going to thank Dr. Standaert so much for your time, for your thoughts, and for answering all those questions. Thank you, everybody, for participating, and we very much look forward to receiving your LOIs by December 16th. If you have any additional questions, I'm going to put my email address, if I can figure out how to do this. I'm going to put my email address in the chat. So please feel free to email me or Elvin Yao, and we can answer any additional questions that you may have. So thanks again for participating, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Thanks.
I'm gonna put I'm not gonna sign off yet, just gonna put my email. All right. Thank you, everyone.